Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Local Link Transit Study Facebook Live event. My name is Katie Corianos, and I'm on the public engagement team for the Local Link Study. Some of you might have joined us back in October for our very first Facebook Live event and may already be aware of what our project is and what we're talking about today. But for those of you less familiar, Local Link is an effort between Salt Lake City, South Salt Lake, Millcreek, and Holladay to help improve connectivity between these communities well into the future. And we're trying to do that through multiple different types of transportation, walking, biking, and transit solutions, which is what we're going to be talking about here today. You'll hear from some key players on the Local Link Study team this morning about exactly where we are in this process and what kind of feedback we need from the public in order to move forward. So I want to do a couple of quick introductions before we get into it so that you know who you're hearing from today. These are key players of the Local Link Study team and leaders from the cities that have partnered together to get this done. First, we'll listen to Lynn Jacobs, our transportation engineer with Salt Lake City, and he's the project manager for Local Link as well. Next, we have John Miller with us today, Public Works Director for Millcreek. We've got Paul Allred, Senior Planning Advisor for City of Holladay, and Sharon Howery, the Urban Design Director with South Salt Lake. Welcome, everybody. We're happy that you're here, and I know we'll have a lot of good things to share with us today. So for our viewers, as we go through the presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the comment section. We will have kind of a dedicated Q&A portion at the end of our event to address anything outstanding, but we will plan to check in periodically with the comments and make sure that we're answering any pressing questions live. We also do have members of our study team kind of behind the scenes that are monitoring that comment and chat section as well to be able to answer any questions that come in depending on what those are. So if there's anything that for any reason we can't answer today that we need more information about to get back with you, we will for sure make sure we're keeping an eye on this event and coming back to answer anything unanswered when we're finished. So now I want to dive a little bit deeper into the content of today, and I'm going to turn it over to Lynn. Again, he's our Local Link project manager with Salt Lake City, and he's going to give us a little more information about some transit alternatives that we're looking at. Lynn?
Thanks, Katie. As Katie mentioned, I'm with Salt Lake City Transportation. I'm the project manager for this project, but I'm really excited to be here today with members of our partner cities and talking about this exciting study and what we've come up with. We're also really grateful to Salt Lake County for helping provide the funding for this study and making this a possibility. Today, we're going to focus more on the second component of the Local Link study, which is our ongoing transit study, where we're looking at connecting Sugar House, Millcreek, and Holladay better to South Salt Lake as well. We're going to dive into possible transit options and routes that have been developed and show you how you can provide feedback to us to help us narrow our choices and figure out what we're doing. Again, please feel free to ask questions in the comment section as we go. Members of our team are monitoring that chat, and they will hopefully be able to answer your questions and follow up with anything that we are not able to talk about in the presentation today. So for our transit study, it's important for everyone to understand why we're doing this study. And we're initiating this study to address our growing population in this area and the traffic projections that we have for 2050. We know that there is no way that we're going to be able to build our way out of the growth that is coming. And cars alone won't be enough to get people around our area. So we're looking at other ways to do that through active transportation, people walking, riding bikes, or taking transit. So today we're going to talk about transit. With all of that in mind, our 4 partner cities sat down to help us develop priorities that would guide our study and help us to decide what we were going to suggest or recommend. And as our partner cities, we're going to kind of each take a couple of these and talk about them and why they're important to us. So John, could you take the first 2?
Thanks, Lynn. Good morning, everyone. John Miller, I'm the Millcreek Public Works Director. I'm glad that we were able to participate on this study. This is just for Millcreek, one of 2 major studies that we're involved in that highlight the Millcreek City Center. We do have a 3300 South corridor study that we're working on now. But the goals of this study, as we look at the north-south transportation, is first of all, the priorities are reasonability, or the affordable and feasible ability to construct the project. There's no point to do a project without knowing the numbers. We will grow whether or not we plan for it or not. This study and your input today and throughout the next few weeks that you'll be able to give will let us know which of the plans are best that we should follow that can meet these goals again, which is affordable, which means potentially which impact the front yards of homes or potentially even may require a full acquisition. Sustainability as well. As we grow in the valley, in this part of the valley, we're grown out. We're growing up now as we get more dense to make things affordable. We can't have the big yards that we do anymore. And as people discover Utah's a great place to live, we have to be able to sustain what we have and to keep what's there. If we don't plan for it, more vehicles are going to make more pollution and more problems. As we found out during the COVID, people like to ride their bikes to work. They like alternatives that we get from at home. These are all part of the reasonability and sustainability approach that are priorities for this study. Sharon, the next couple.
Thanks. I'm Sharon Hari, the Urban Design Director for the City of South Salt Lake, and I'll talk a little bit about choice and about movement. We are giving options to people for all modes of travel. So just because we're talking about transit doesn't mean we're only talking transit. We're also talking about all the things that lead into transit, from walking and biking, or come into just those on their own right. How do we make things better for people who aren't taking any vehicle at all? So why is this important to South Salt Lake and Sugar House and the other communities that are here? It's because we have, at least in South Salt Lake, a very young and diverse population, and they have a lot of interest in doing different modes. They want to walk and bike. They're active. They moved here to be active. And they also are conscious about the environment. They do want to reduce their carbon footprint. They want to feel like they're being proactive in their choices every day. So we're trying to offer them those choices. We have choices all around our valley for transit, walking, and biking, but they are still kind of in the beginning stages of quality and usage. And when young people speak, we try to listen. We're trying to give them better quality and more quantity of those items. Second is the movement. We are trying to keep people on the move. That's actually our city motto, kind of fun. But we want people to be able to get places where they're trying to go easily and actually make the choice for them that gives them the least amount of time either sitting in traffic or making their trip that day. So in the end, this project talks a lot about reducing congestion. And that's important because we are growing and we are seeing more congestion in other parts of the valley, especially if you're commuting. So we're lucky in these areas that we have the ability to actually reasonably and feasibly walk and bike and take transit. So getting into a different mode of transportation can reduce congestion on the road. And as we grow, and we know we will, that's really important. When we grow in these areas by building transit, that spurs more intense urban development, and then that spurs more walkability and bikeability, which then in turn leads to reduced car trips. So we know that this land use and transportation connection is tied together like this, and we're trying to make it the most of it, make it into an opportunity. Thanks.
Paul, you're up.
Hi, good to be here today. And I've got to say, from the perspective of the city of Holladay, this has been a great study. It's really been enlightening. And I want to thank all of the cities that we've worked with on this. I'm going to talk about connectivity and accessibility. You know, we take our roads for granted, but, you know, roads are very expensive to build and maintain. And roads don't have unlimited capacity. But roads take us to places we need to go and we want to go. Many people in our area, Millcreek, Holladay, Sugar House, South Salt Lake, it's a very compact area if you think about it. And many people kind of consider this as an area that's very similar in terms of demographics and the way that it feels when you drive around the area. I think a lot of people can identify with that. And a lot of people in the past have had to concentrate their activities outside of their towns as being purely suburban and going downtown or further south to do things. And up to this point, there's been no unified way to address getting around except by car. And so many of our vehicle trips are to activity centers or nodes. And in the Middle East bench is what I call, or the East Middle bench is where we are. There are several nodes that are in the process of being developed or redeveloped. And we're experiencing a change of land use in this area. South Salt Lake is going vertical. Millcreek is doing the Millcreek Center. Holladay, our community, the old Cottonwood Mall site is redeveloping. And of course, we have the Holladay Village. And instead of all the activity going downtown, there's going to be a need for people to access these activity nodes in multiple ways. So creating transit opportunities in this area will allow residents to connect to existing and new activity centers as they're created, and mobility options in their own community as they connect to traditional centers too. Because downtown you have transit hubs. And so connectivity is super important, not only in your own community, but as you go further afield. Now you can get into Utah County, you can get into Davis County with Front Runner. So connecting to transit hubs from these communities is important, and not just by car. So these connections are vital, and we've got to think about connectivity as an important issue. Increased local transit also reduces congestion elsewhere, as in downtown, which has always been highly congested. So it's important that we see ourselves not as islands, but as one combined larger community that are connected with each other in both movement and economy. And connectivity creates economy and opportunity. If people can't move, money can't move, and the speed of money is the speed of our economy. So let's talk for a second about accessibility and equity. Private vehicles are commanding more and more a share of the budget of single-family households, and not everybody can afford an expensive car, the gas and the insurance for it. And so for those who have limited physical, economic, or other abilities, who do not have or want to have a private vehicle, there needs to be an option for them to move like everybody else. So transit creates accessibility, which in turn creates equity or fairness. And transit creates the ability for us to be connected to places that we want to go and that we love to go, that are close to home but not within walking distance. We know that our population in Utah, and especially in these communities, is aging rapidly. We are some of the oldest communities in the Salt Lake Valley. And so in addition to the young people who to a great extent use transit, we'll need to consider additional capacity and how to take care of our seniors safely and equitably in the future. So as time goes on, these areas that we're in now, these cities that we're talking about, will create a greater share of transit demand, mass transit, and should be considered as an overall part of a transit plan for the valley. But up until now, there's been no long-range study for this part of the valley. So to consider one of these four options for these communities is really important. Lynn, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah, and finally, the last two priorities that we have together as four cities are adaptability and safety. Look, the Sugar House area has been changing at a rapid pace for at least 50 years. I've had the privilege of working there for the last 15 years, and I've got to say it's changed dramatically over that amount of time. And if anything, the speed of that transformation is accelerating and is speeding up. Millcreek and Holladay are seeing real serious growth, as is downtown South Salt Lake. And so all of these communities are experiencing rapid changes of change. It's happening so quickly. And so we want to make sure that whatever idea that we put out there, whatever project that we propose, is something that could be adapted to an unforeseeable future as things change and are just different than what we expect. We as transportation planners try to do our best to project what things will be like in the future, but we know that it's an ever moving target. And so we just want to make sure that what we come up with is something that will fit the needs, not only today, but for a long time into the future. And finally, safety is critical to us as a group of cities and as a group of professionals. I recently saw a presentation by Carlos Braceras, our director of UDOT. Over the last year, our highway and automobile fatalities in the state of Utah have gone up, even though traffic volumes have gone down. And it's a real problem that we have. Safety is just of a high concern to all of us. And so we cannot afford to sacrifice safety on our roadways for moving people. And so we are looking at a lot of these options as being safer options for people to get around. Our transit options often have lower fatality rates or lower accident rates than private automobiles do. And so that really is a benefit to us to think about transit as a solution for this area. So with that, I'd like to look at some of the options that we've been talking about for transit in this area. And let's start with the route first, because I think that is really important. We've been looking at two possible routes. One goes down Highland Drive and the other goes down 1300 East. The reason that we look at these two routes is that they're the most obvious connections between these communities, and also connect really well to the terminus of the S-Line streetcar that goes to South Salt Lake. And so we know that as these roads are now, they will not meet the demands of the future, that the growth that is coming at us is just too much for the roads to be able to handle far into the future. And so we really know that a transit solution is what we need to improve this connection and provide more options, and frankly, the ability to move more people in a sustainable way north and south in this area. On both of these options, we have a little dash line that shows a potential connection over to Holladay Village. And so that dash line, as we show you the numbers, the ridership, the cost, as we get into those details here in a few minutes, those dash lines are not included in our overall picture, but we think that that's an important future connection that should be considered. And I want to turn some time over to Paul to talk about what's happening at Holladay Village and in that area of Holladay and why it's important to make that connection.
You know, the Holladay Village is only a half mile from the Cottonwood Mall. A lot of people don't realize that. The Holladay Village, while the Cottonwood Mall has been kind of dark for well over a decade now, almost 15 years, it's been very important for us to develop the Holladay Village. It's become a very popular place with food trucks, restaurants, plaza. There's park at City Hall. There's a lot going on in the village, and it's going vertical, and we're also building some housing there. Murray Holladay Road, which connects to 2300 East and Holladay Boulevard at that main intersection, is our busiest travel route. There's about 23,000 cars a day. From what we've seen in the past, that half mile is an extremely busy street. And so it may make a lot of sense to consider it, taking a connection from the mall up to the village based on what's going on there, and plus the intensity of the traffic in that area. So, Lynn, back to you.
Thanks, Paul. So we've got two routes that we're looking at and considering, and we want your feedback on. We're also looking at different kinds or modes of transportation. And so let's start off with streetcar. You should all be fairly familiar with the S-Line. So streetcars are rail transit vehicles designed for local transportation on a city street, powered by overhead electricity. What's interesting about streetcar, and it's a little different than what we have our S-Line operating as today, is that it's really designed to be in the road or in a travel lane with cars. And so you're kind of using the same space that cars are using, and you put a streetcar in that same physical space. The next option is light rail. Light rail, you should all be familiar with our track system. So the red line, the blue line, the green line. The difference between streetcar and light rail tends to operate at a higher speed, and light rail is also generally in its own dedicated right of way or own dedicated space on the roadway. And so to get light rail on this corridor, we would have to widen or add some space for that light rail vehicle to fill in. Next option for us that we've been looking at is something called bus rapid transit. And this is a bus-based transit system. It also includes a dedicated lane just for the buses. Great example of this is actually down in Utah Valley. It's the Utah Valley Express that connects the Orem Intermodal Hub to UVU, to the malls, to BYU, and back over to Provo Intermodal Hub. It's been very successful. It's done really well. So that UVX is what it's called, is a really good example of this bus rapid transit system and what that could look like. Again, this requires its own dedicated lanes and travels, kind of outside of the car's travel lanes. And then the last option we've been looking at is something called enhanced bus. And essentially what enhanced bus is it takes our existing bus system and it runs it more frequently. And we provide better shelters, and we maybe make some branding for the bus to make it look iconic or distinct. And then it also, you could provide some technological innovation to make it operate faster, more efficiently, and be really competitive with other modes of transportation in terms of how fast it goes. We have a really good example of where we're starting to do this on Redwood Road. Our bus line that runs north-south on Redwood Road now has some really great technological enhancements at the signals that give it an ability to kind of go faster and stay on schedule. And so that's kind of an early adoption of this idea, but we think that, you know, this could be a really good solution for our dilemma, our problem out here. So we've been looking at these 4 options and we want to kind of compare them. And there's a number of ways that we're looking at comparing them. Obviously, cost is really important. We've got to be judicious in the way that we spend our resources. And so we look at how much each of them cost. We look at the feasibility from an engineering perspective. How complicated would it be to build? Do we have a lot of utility relocates that have to happen with each of these? How compatible is it with our existing system? Next, we look at how impactful it would be to the community in terms of right-of-way acquisition. Do we have to purchase a lot of properties to build one of these? Or is it something that we could, you know, just take some small strip takes or little pieces of property to make it work? Next is ridership. How many people do we actually think would use the system, and does that justify the cost and the impacts on the community? And so we look at that. And then finally, because sustainability is so important to us, we also look at what it does for our air quality in terms of, you know, emission savings and reductions in our carbon footprint. So those are all things that we look at and consider as we think about projects like these. We have this chart that you can kind of compare everything side by side. We're going to get a little bit more into the details of each of these next and look at them a little bit tighter. So how do these impact property? We've gone through and done an evaluation of about how many properties we think that we would need to take in order to build any of these facilities. In other words, the cities would have to actually purchase the property in order to acquire the room that we need on the roadway. So we have a big range here. Enhanced bus is the least impactful because it operates pretty much within the roadway that we already have, all the way to light rail, which would be the most impactful. And, you know, we could have to purchase up to 50 to 60, maybe even 70 properties with that light rail on Highland Drive. So that's kind of the range that we're looking at. BRT is more impactful than the streetcar, remembering that the streetcar operates in kind of the existing travel lanes, whereas the BRT, you have to purchase right away to actually give it exclusive lanes to run in. Highland Drive tends to be a little bit tighter for us, and so it's a little bit harder to fit these facilities on Highland Drive. And so you'll see that the right-of-way impacts that we see on Highland Drive are higher than they are on 1300 East. Definitely something that we need to consider in terms of our impacts to the neighborhood. Enhanced bus doesn't have any full takes, but we do expect that we'd have to purchase some right-of-way, especially at, you know, bus stop locations to make them better or nicer. We'd have to look at doing that, and a couple other locations on the corridor. And so, you know, we've got kind of a range of impacts here in terms of property impacts. The next thing we really want to look at is how many people each of these options would move. And so we actually did a comparison here against automobiles, the enhanced bus, streetcar, BRT, and light rail. The automobile is, what if we were to go out as a group of cities and say, look, we just need to widen the road and add another lane for cars. How many people could we move if we were to do that? And you can see, due to the inefficiencies of single occupancy vehicles, that that's actually not a very big number. And that would require a lot of the similar impacts that we're seeing for BRT and light rail in terms of property impacts, because widening these roadways is really difficult without having to purchase properties. You just can't do it. And so adding an automobile lane would be impactful to the community, and it would not give us as much capacity to move people as some of these other options, which is why we're talking about transit on this corridor in the first place. So thinking about enhanced bus or streetcar, each of these, kind of the capacity of how many people we can actually move increases as you look at kind of the scale of project. The next thing we wanted to talk about is how many people we actually think would use it. So first we talked about how much capacity we have. The next is based on our land use, based on our projected land use, and how these would operate, how many people would actually want to use each of these facilities. And it's a pretty good number. Between enhanced bus, streetcar, and BRT, it's similar. And then light rail obviously is a little bit higher. The bigger investment we make, the more attractive we make it, the more we think people would actually be using it. So this is in 2050, the number of riders that we would expect to get per day on each of these facilities if they were built. And we worked tightly with UTA to make sure that, the way we were doing that matches the way that they're looking at other projects around the valley. So finally, how would it impact air quality? Well, obviously light rail, since it would move the most people and get the most people off of the road, would have the best benefit in terms of our impact to reducing metric tons of carbon, whereas the enhanced bus is the least impactful in terms of improving our air quality in the area. This is for, climate change type perspectives, but it also applies very well to local air quality and just making the air quality we have here in the valley better. The more we look at these, electric and more efficient ways of moving people around, the better it is for our air quality. So finally, cost perspective. Obviously, light rail would be by far away the most expensive. These project costs include the construction of the facility, road widening where needed, any associated right-of-way costs to purchase property, and also operational costs. So for instance, on light rail, we'd have to purchase some light rail vehicles. So we've included that in this cost estimate. So light rail is obviously the most expensive. Enhanced bus would be the least expensive, with BRT and streetcar kind of being in the middle of the pack there. So kind of good way to think about it. Enhanced bus has very few impacts, doesn't provide as big of a benefit as some of these other projects do, whereas light rail has the most impacts but provides the most benefits as well. And that's kind of the way to think about these in comparison to each other. And so finally, we want to talk a little bit about how each of these options would change the existing roadway. So we've got an example cross section for 1300 East and Highland Drive. So this is what the roadway looks like if you were looking at it, from the south looking north. And the top one is our existing roadway. Enhanced bus would look exactly the same because we're not talking about adding, width for this enhanced bus. It would generally operate on the same facility that we already have. Light rail, we'd actually have to widen the roadway to accommodate the light rail. We'd have to add those lanes in. And so that's the expense and the impact in right away that we talked about. Streetcar would require a little bit of widening, but not as much as light rail because that streetcar is operating in the travel lane with cars. And so we don't need to add an additional lane to accommodate that streetcar. The bus rapid transit facility would be similar in widening to the light rail facility, where we actually do have to add lanes in each direction to accommodate that bus rapid transit facility for this project. So I think that pretty much sums up a lot of what we wanted to share with you today. I'd like to turn the time over to Paul now to kind of help wrap it up and explain why our cities are talking about this and why this project is important for us collectively as a group of cities.
Thank you, Lynn. There's an obvious question here, and that is, why are we studying future transit options for our partner cities? Perhaps a better question would be, why haven't we planned for this already? If you look at our part of the valley, I noticed this when I started working for Holladay, and even before I came to work for the city. We're in a transit shadow. Other parts of the valley, mass transit has been extended to them. Salt Lake City has a network. We have a spine of transit that goes down the middle of the valley. Then we have spines that go off from there out to West Valley, clear out to Daybreak, and more coming. But if you look at the upper east side of the valley, there isn't any transit. There's nothing. From Draper all the way to downtown, there's nothing that follows these major streets, Highland Drive, 13th East. And it begs the question, why have we been left out? And I think it's long overdue that this part of the valley, that you can assume that this part of the valley doesn't need it. And I think there are some factors in that. I think some people look at this part of the valley and say we have a higher income demographic, and so you guys can all drive. But as we've talked about today, these cities are densifying. These cities are going more vertical. And that process may be slow, but year after year, year over year, we will see an increasing number of people living in these communities. And this population density is already very high. Anybody out there would challenge them to look at the population densities of the Sugar House, the South Salt Lake, Millcreek, and Holladay areas, and you'll see that our densities are actually very high already. So And we're also, we've got some demographic challenges too, with a real aging population, lots of older people, and who are going to be more challenged to move around in just their cars. So I guess, from our perspective as a group, we should remember that everything that we do needs to address the future. And it would be a big mistake not to, pardon the pun, look down the road into both our short-term and long-term futures in terms of these nodes being built, in terms of our recreation opportunities near our canyons and our parks, and of course, just our general land use and our commercial areas. So the transit we have now in the valley didn't occur overnight. It was thought about years before it was built. And some of us will remember that light rail transit was initially rejected. I think a lot of people forget that. There was a vote on it and it was turned down, and it came back up and it finally went through. But it was controversial to build light rail. Now that's something we take for granted. And we take for granted Front Runner. We see it going up and down, into Davis County, Weber County, Utah County, serving huge populations. And so those things didn't happen overnight. They had to be thought of well in advance. And one thing that's true about human nature is we tend to put off thinking about what we need until it's too late sometimes. And it's not too late here. And it's time for this part of the valley to take a serious look at transit, what it can do, what those options are. We've come a long way since light rail and Front Runner have been built. And now's not the time to put our heads in the sands and think that we don't need to continue to plan for proven future ways to move people equitably and efficiently to the places they're going to want and need to go. So I hopefully that puts a little bit of a summary on it for our cities. And Katie, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. I think that forward-thinking perspective is going to be really important as we kind of ask the public to weigh in on some of these options that we've taken a look at. So I appreciate you emphasizing that point for sure. Before I move on and tell you guys exactly how to get involved and help us out with this, I do want to back up a little bit. We've got a question from Alex on Facebook. What are the advantages of streetcar, light rail to high frequency or bus rapid transit? Lynn, can you take that one for us?
Absolutely. Great question, Alex, because there's obviously trade-offs here, right? In terms of costs, in terms of the impacts of the community. And so it's something that we really need to think about well. Some of the advantages to light rail and streetcar, first off, they tend to have higher capacity. In other words, they can carry more people because of the design of the vehicle. The vehicle is actually a larger vehicle. And so that enables us to kind of increase the number of people that we can move per vehicle, which increases the capacity that we have. The second thing that's really interesting about rail transit as opposed to rubber tire or bus transit is that it's got a sense of permanence to it. So if we go out and build a rail, we really are demonstrating to the community that this is going to be a facility that we are committed to continuing to operate long into the future. And that kind of permanence tends to attract the kind of development that works really well with transit. And so there's this whole perspective to it that if you build this rail facility that's a more permanent facility, that you get the kind of development that drives towards transit better. Not to belittle our bus rapid transit or enhanced bus perspective at all, because those have benefits as well on the other side in terms of their ability to, be attractive. We can really make them nice and really spruce them up. As I mentioned in our presentation, light rail and the BRT would require some substantial widening on these roadways, whereas the enhanced bus and the streetcar would not. And so that's a good way to kind of differentiate. Enhanced bus is kind of to BRT as streetcar is to light rail. And so you can kind of think of it in that perspective. And really, we wanted to evaluate bring all four options to the public, get your feedback, get your input, and take all of that and kind of go back to the table and think about it some more. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, happy to continue that discussion.
We've got another question that came in from Aaron on Facebook. And this is one that I think we'd love to hear this feedback, Aaron, in kind of this public process for looking at these options. I'll just kind of start by saying that. But wondering, Lynn, if you could talk to any details about considering Highland drives, particularly between 27 South and 2100 South, which is already one lane each way, when 1300 East already has multiple lanes.
Great question. So we're talking about the northern section of this, kind of just coming out of Sugar House. The reason we elected to have both routes use that portion of Highland Drive is because it connects us right to the terminus of the streetcar, the S line. And so that was one of the big drivers or impetus for us to want to keep it on Highland Drive in this area. The other major reason we wanted to do this is look over on 13th East in this area, we've got the interchange with I-80, and that gets really congested and really complicated as we start to think about how we take these transit solutions through that interchange and through all of the heavy automobile traffic flow that is happening right there on 13th East in that area. And so those were some of the considerations, but really good feedback, and love to hear that from you, and definitely something we could, come kind of take back as a team and take a hard look at.
Thanks, Lynn. Sharon, it sounds like you had some information you'd like to share about Streetcar and that urban development piece. Do you want to go back to that?
Hey, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, you're good.
I just wanted to remind people that we had a lot of conversation about these issues when we built the streetcar, and the streetcar was chosen for a specific reason to create an urban area and create Sugar House as this urban district that it had a history of being, but taking it to the next level. And South Salt Lake got on board with that too, because we could see some real benefits to creating a downtown and using the transit we have to its maximum benefit. So think about that too. Different types of transit create different results in the development that happens too.
And I could say that you could look at what the streetcar has done for South Salt Lake and the Sugar House area in terms of the development that's happened. And that's a definite case example of, its ability to drive that. Thank you, Sharon. Great addition there.
Yeah. So I did want to hit on a couple of things. As Lynn mentioned, all of the information, the great information he's gone through today, is available for further review on our study website. So locallinkstudy.com is where you can find information about everything we've gone through today. We encourage all of you to spend a little more time with that, really look through kind of the data and those graphics to understand the comparisons and the trade-offs, like Lynn mentioned, between the routes, 1300 East and Highland Drive, as well as those 4 types of transit. I mentioned that that's something, with Aaron's question, that's the kind of feedback that we're looking for. Once you go through all that information and feel comfortable with it, we do have a button to take a transit survey. So you'll click on that. It will open up a quick, pretty easy survey. We're asking for some information just about you and who you are so we can understand who we're reaching. And then we'll get into some pretty direct questions about how you feel about what you've seen today and what you've reviewed on the website, and what values are really most important to you in determining the future of transportation in these cities to connect these communities. So we encourage everybody to do that. If you've got any questions or problems going through this, you can contact our team at any time. We've got a hotline as well as an email address that we're there monitoring and ready to chat with you about anything you'd like to. And I'm sure the rest of the team, I can speak on their behalf. If there's anyone that would like to have more of a detailed one-on-one conversation about what this means, we're very much open to that and want to be as accessible and transparent about this study process as possible. And with that, I want to ask a couple of questions to the group. Some things that have come in as we've presented these alternatives and things like that to different stakeholders over the last couple of weeks. One big question is, what happens after Local Link? Like, what are the outcomes of this study and this effort that we're going to do, and how will those recommendations be implemented in the future? Lynn, is that something you want to take as a project manager and kind of start that off, and then each city might go in?
And Paul, John, and Sharon, feel free to chime in on any of this. But essentially for us, after this Local Link study is completed here in the next couple of months, we're going to take it to our city leadership and get them to approve or comment on it. But from there, really what happens next is that we've got to kind of go into the next step of this effort. And that's as a group of cities, we really need to get our results or our recommendations onto our region's transportation master plan so that we can get in line for funding to get whatever we recommend built. And so what that looks like is that we go collectively as 4 cities and get this project added to that plan. And then once it gets added to the plan, our next step is to complete an environmental study before we can do anything. We need to go out and go through that process, and then get it designed, get our engineering done, and then ultimately get to construction. But understand that all of this takes a considerable amount of time. And frankly, to get there, we've got to get funding. step one is getting it onto the regional transportation plan so that we're eligible for funding and we can go and compete for funding with other projects.
Yeah, I think
Paul,
Lynn,
John, go
yeah,
ahead.
Lynn, you've touched on a couple of really important points. I would probably say step one is getting each community support. I think if elected leadership, if we can get them on board to look down the road, look way out in the future and realize this isn't going to be built tomorrow. And another thing is, if you can get community sign off, especially those elected officials, then you can't get them into the regional plan for funding without that. And so it's super critical to persuade the local officials to understand that they're not going to be paying all of its money for those things, and nor will the residents, because there's a lot of fear out there when you start talking about this. People feel like, oh my gosh, you look at these costs, there's no way we can do that. Well, that's not how these things are mostly paid for. So political support, getting it in the plan and then getting it funded could make it a reality. But again, it takes a long time for this to happen. And so people tend to worry that they'll be cramming a bus or a rail down the middle of their street, tomorrow, just because we're talking about it. This is just kind of the first step, but it's the most important step. And that's laying a foundation.
Sorry, Paul, didn't mean to interrupt, but as a quick follow-up to that, you mentioned that's not how these things are paid for, how they happen. Could you guys give a couple of examples of how funding is typically allocated for transit projects like this, or some ideas for potential options for that?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of the funding for transportation projects comes through the federal government, and it trickles down to the states. It goes to UDOT. And of course, there are some, there are local taxes as well, minor taxes, some increases, of course, for transit and those kinds of things. But the bulk of the infrastructure costs are not borne by each resident. A lot of this, again, comes from our federal government and allocations to states. And, Lynn, do you want to elaborate on that? Because I think, again, there's a lot of fear about the cost associated with transit. And I think that's why there's been a lot of opposition to it in the past, too.
It looked like John might have had something to add, and then I can also add my 2 cents to it.
Oh, Paul and Lynn, you guys are much better talking than an engineer. Nobody likes to listen to us, but you're spot on. This is planning for the future. The funding takes a while to get in the queue, if you will, for a project such as this. In fact, one great example is the 39th South project that's currently under construction.
Yeah.
It's a 4-year process from when the project environmental study was done. It's been on that regional transportation plan for many years before that, as a need in the community and the residents to be able to expand and widen. And if I may take a minute to get on a tangent, it's interesting. My family grew up in the Holladay area. In fact, the Holladay Center right now is where my grandfather's store, Carlos Smith Showcase, used to be. And my grandparents tell the story of the trolley that used to be there that was basically a victim of the 1940s when we had the war and things changed. They tell the story how they got around. They went to Sugar House and that they were connected with other people in those days. And it's interesting. We're kind of back to the future of trying to plan what's the best ways to get around now. Just great opportunities. And let me reemphasize, this is for not tomorrow, not next year, but probably 10 to 30 years out, this plan and implementation to get it going. We either plant our heads in the sand and let it grow by itself, and hopefully it works out, which usually doesn't, or we plan for it and we try to get the best solution in our crystal ball. There's a lot of other things too, like autonomous vehicles and other things. How do those affect it? We need to be adaptable and flexible enough with this plan and get it on that region plan so that when things start coming together and linking, what a great name, Local Link, that we're ready to get something done that allows us to get where we want to move the way we want to. Enough talking from the engineer.
Perfectly said, John. I'm an engineer too, so I don't know why anyone likes to hear it from me, but there you go. Federal money is really important in our transportation world, and it's how we fund the bulk of the projects that we do, whether it's roadway projects or transit projects or anything really. We do get really good support from our state legislature and get really great investments from them that help a ton. But honestly, projects of this magnitude really have to compete at a federal level for money that's out there. And so I think Sharon wanted to talk a little bit about stimulus funding and how that kind of plays in. And I think that's really a great example, because that's how we built the first phase of the streetcar that we have. So Sharon, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I know it seems like government moves really slowly, and everyone says, well, why don't you just do that? And they hope it's done tomorrow. Or when they say, why doesn't you do that? And then it's done 2 years from now, they think that because they said it, it happened 2 years later. But it's usually that somebody 10 years ago said, we should really think about this. And the streetcar is a story. It really started 10 years earlier. So did the plans for the Parleys Trail adjacent to it. Those both had environmental impact statements done years before. And then through the prioritization, even with UTA, they said, well, these aren't as high priority as some of the light rail investments. But then it came down from the federal legislation during the Great Recession that we were going to have Tiger funds, which stood for transportation investments generating economic reinvestment, I think, or returns. And lo and behold, our project for streetcar was considered highly worthy of that, which then brought us the federal funds, which we had to find the local funds to match. But it was funny, it leaped it over the priorities. So these cities are actively building urban centers. And I think that's the really appealing part of any competitive grant for transit funding. So if we have the EIS done and waiting and looking for opportunities, that's going to push us a few years ahead in schedule. Also, if we are thinking of this jointly as a way to solve multiple problems at once, not just the transportation problem, but the land use problem, the affordability problem, the equity problem, then that also makes us more competitive. So that's why this is a really well thought out study with all of these factors.
Great point, Sharon. We have a couple of, oh, go ahead.
Just one other thing, and that is local government's kind of interesting. You know, somebody has said to me once, local government is different than any other hierarchy. It's an organization where every 2 years, 40 or 60% of your leadership can disappear. And so there's a long permanency issue here that is also critical too. And that is, even if we can get the cities to buy off on this, there are changes in leadership. And with that extended period of time that it takes for these projects to occur, it's very important that there is somebody at the local level to champion this. And usually it's staff, somebody who's there for a long time, hopefully, who can constantly keep this on the front burner, so to speak, so it doesn't get forgotten. And as changes in elected leadership occur, it doesn't fall by the wayside.
And if I can add, it's like dominoes. You got to set them up so when they start to fall, everything comes together. And I think Sharon gave a great example on that S line of how it works.
We got a couple of follow-up questions from Alex on Facebook. The first, do these transit options we're talking about reduce private vehicle roadway capacity, or do they assume a constant roadway capacity? Lynn, can you
we have tried really hard to hold that kind of harmless and try to make it so that we don't really change the private automobile capacity that we have out here. So if you think about it, our light rail and our BRT solutions add a travel lane for the most part to avoid taking away from the capacity we have on the roadway. The streetcar and the enhanced bus would have a very minor influence on roadway capacity because it's a vehicle that's taking up space in the roadway. But if they're running every 10 minutes, you're talking 5 or 6 vehicles an hour. That's not really changing our automobile capacity through this project. So generally speaking, we're not looking to make substantial changes there. We're trying to hold that kind of constant or hold that harmless. As this project advances to the next stage where we look an environmental study, that would need to we'd have to evaluate that more in depth than we have to this point, and so we'd be looking at very detailed analysis of that as it kind of moves forward. But at a conceptual level, one of our goals is to be said, look, we need as much capacity as we can get, however we can get it, and this is a good way to add capacity without taking away from what we already have.
And another one from Alex, he wants to know if electric buses are being considered, especially in terms of that pollution avoidance.
Absolutely. I think that's something UTA is constantly looking at. There's a fairly significant cost in terms of changing the fleet over to buses or all the buses over to electric. But corridors like this just beg for it, right? And as the technology gets better and better and cheaper, I think it's the future. We've got to move to electrification of our fleet and get to where all of our buses are running that way. But I think, this could be, if we go with like the BRT or the enhanced bus perspective, this could be a good way to kind of early adopt that and get that focused on this corridor. And that really helps not only with our climate change type initiatives, but it really helps with our local air quality as we eliminate that diesel fuel or diesel fumes that come out of the buses. So that's an obvious thing that we want to do. There's a cost associated with it and it takes time. The technology is constantly getting better and cheaper though. And so the day will come where it's just like a no-brainer and we see that happen. That's my perspective. I don't know, Sharon or Paul or John, if you guys have any other perspectives to share on those two questions.
I had a similar thought. I didn't bring it up during the study, but having ridden electric buses in other metro areas, they seem really pretty efficient and of course very clean. But the overhead wires and stuff, that's not cheap. It's pretty expensive. And like you said, the conversion of diesel to electric doesn't happen cheaply. One thing that as the technology changes, though, I wonder, if you see the more of the electric vehicles out there, I wonder if battery powered buses, like the battery powered cars, we have Teslas and others. I wonder if that's going to be a realistic possibility to push around really heavy vehicles with batteries. And if so, that could be a real game changer too.
Well, and Paul, that's the way Park City's doing it right now. And so they've moved to kind of battery operated buses and it's absolutely on the table in terms of technologies that already exist. They're expensive, but over time, like I said, those are getting cheaper. Batteries are getting cheaper. The technology is getting smaller, weighs less. It's the future. And I think we have to all know that that's where we're headed with this. And I think that's a great outcome. And I think that can happen regardless of whether we do this project or not.
Yeah.
I was just going to add on the question with congestion and roadway capacity, and are we adding more drivers? It's very hard to take a multivariable equation like this and simplify it, but we all know, I think intuitively, that we're going to grow, we're going to add more drivers and cars because they're coming to every corner of the valley. So in this study, while we're holding stuff steady, I think we all expect that over time, we are just going to have more congestion as a valley. If you look at California, that's the example I always point to, not just because it has the more people, but it also has a similar type of road network that we have and was built on a grid like we were, and has a lot of pressure on development right now. But I would go back to saying, we will have congestion and that will drive people's choices. And so human behavior is one of the biggest factors in that. And there are a whole other studies about managing human behavior and the choices they make, but if we give them choice, they can actually change.
Well, and one thing that I always talk about here at the local level is that population is never static. Land area, the space that we live on, we're crammed in between mountains and lakes. We can't really grow up. The mountainsides are too steep. We don't have vast areas of flat land that we can expand out into, nor perhaps would we want to. But if you think about it, our ability to reproduce and make more children and them to have future children means we're going to have to grow inward. We're going to have to fill in the cracks and we're going to have to be more innovative. And it's because people simply continue to have children. And we're going to densify because that's not going to stop happening. It just isn't.
And I think it's important to say that this is one piece of the pie. We're looking at one corridor. This has to occur on multiple locations, multiple corridors. There's multiple transit solutions and modes because cars aren't going to go away. Other types of commute is going to happen over this COVID pandemic. More people have worked from home, which means less trips on the road, which is a boon for everyone. And so we're going to continue to not only this section in our neck of the woods worry about, but we're going to worry about other places to tie into it. As we age, we need to go to the hospital. 39th and 13th is a regional hospital. And there's, as Paul said, as we have kids, unless we're going to start doing it in our homes, we're probably going to need to make it to the hospital. And we need to keep those connections, those links open, easily accessible, with multiple alternatives to get there.
I think something I'd like to touch on quickly, we've talked a lot about these options, right, and types of transportation, and our whole circulation study that we did prior to this was about walking and biking connections in and out of these areas. Lynn, could you tackle how these possible transit improvements actually account for bikes?
You bet. As part of our circulation study, just as you said, Katie, we recommended adding bike facilities to both of these corridors to provide choices, to provide options. And so as you can see, as we look at our cross sections, that's a recommendation that we have for both Highland Drive and 1300 East. And we've incorporated that recommendation into each and every one of these modes. This is really important to get transit to work well, because a lot of people don't live at a bus stop. They got to get there somehow. And so giving them an ability to walk or ride a bike to get there, to get on the transit vehicle, makes it work. And it also gives them another option to just ride their bike where they're going instead of even using the transit facility at all. And so we've looked at Sugar House and we've said, we can't add more roads. We can't add a lot more vehicular capacity. The only way we can move more people is to move them through walking, riding bikes, and taking transit. That's the only solution that we've got in the future. And so this is the way we get there. And as we've said, it'll take time and it'll take work, but we believe that this is the future for this area. Sharon, did you want to add anything to that?
Just that this is a route people will use currently. That's a biking route.
That's great. So our final question that we wanted to hit on, and I talked about this a little bit, but it doesn't hurt to hit it home. How can my voice be heard? How can the public get involved in this? And how will my input be used? So like I mentioned before, locallinkstudy.com is where we're pushing everybody to go to take in this information and participate in the transit survey. We're going to keep the survey open through April 22nd, so about a month from now. We encourage you to share this with everybody that you know, people who live, work, visit, travel through the area. We really want to get this information out there because, like we've talked about, this is something we need to be considering for the future of our valley. So please share that information. You can contact us at any time with questions. We'd be happy to go into more depth and detail about that. And after that month, we'll compile all of that data and information that we've received from the public, present it to the study team, sift through everything. There's a space for kind of open-ended feedback as well in the survey. So we'll want to consider all of that feedback that we're getting from you and the public, take that into kind of the study process, distill it down, and hopefully use that to come up with one preferred alternative, is what we like to call it, one preferred option. So the preferred route as well as the preferred type of transit going forward. Anything to add to that, Lynn?
No, just look forward to hearing your voice and hearing your input. This is a hard, challenging problem that we've got to solve, and we really want to hear what the community has to say about it so that we make a good choice that works for all of us.
Absolutely. The public is critical to this. We're looking forward to it. Again, we thank everybody for being here today and for our city representatives. It's pretty cool to see a genuine partnership with these 4 cities to get something done that has legs and can be implemented into the future. So thanks for everybody's time. We're going to wrap up now. And if there's any outstanding questions in the chat, we'll go ahead and follow up on those offline. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.